there.
I did tell Talia that I would grow my beard out full wizard length when I turn 60, but I've still got a couple decades. So
love it.
All right, let's introduce this. So welcome to the October Institute for Liberal Values panel, ILV. What we are going to do today is discuss the themes of intolerance, liberalism, and conservatism. I think that's quite important because liberalism and conservatism are often presented as being on one end of the scale, you know, with conservatism and liberalism at the other, which I think is obviously fallacious. So my name is Mike Burke. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Liberal Values, ILV, and I am joined by Rio Varadania and Joshua Equal. Rio is from Queer Majority, and Joshua is from Project Liberal, which maybe, Joshua, you can quickly explain Project Liberal, then Rio, Queer Majority.
Yeah, so Project Liberal is an organization. It's a nonprofit that we started about last year. The goal of the organization is to basically build a cross-partisan coalition to defend liberal values in the pursuit of a free and open society. We see authoritarianism on the rise across the political spectrum, and we think that it's time for liberals to unite in defense of the values that made society great. And so, yeah, that's the 10,000-foot view.
Thank you very much. And Rio, Queer Majority, how would you describe Queer Majority?
Hi, Mike. Hi, Joshua. Hello. Queer Majority is an online publication that was founded in 2019 with the goal of recentering queer discourse on liberal values. Because unfortunately, a lot of extremists in the LGBT movement have been claiming to speak on behalf of regular LGBT people, most of whom are just normal liberals like you and me. And so we decided to create a publication that would stand up for the queer majority, so to speak. And we're in partnership with both Project Liberal and the Institute for Liberal Values, which I guess is why you asked us to come on today, Mike.
Absolutely correct. And I think that's a really good place to start because in my opinion, unfortunately, these kind of fringe LGBT extremists that pop up on TikTok often, and I don't think it's any accident that that's a platform that is owned by the Chinese Communist Party via one of their proxies. I really don't think there's any accident behind that at all. But unfortunately, I think they've been quite successful in framing themselves as being the legitimate voice of the LGBT community. It seems to me that for many people, unless you're a gay person who outright comes and says, I'm gay, but I'm not one of these people, then you are viewed with suspicion. I mean, even for Queer Majority, actively coming out against wokeism and wokery, for the article that I wrote that, made the case that we weren't about trying to convert the kids to being gay, and we don't think that's a good idea or anything like that. I was still attacked. I was called, I was made the victim of some quite horrific homophobic abuse. Is that the norm now?
Yeah. I think that part of the reason the extremists have been able to dominate the conversation is because even opponents of LGBT rights were too happy to allow them to do so, right? Because if they can point to one extreme and say, hey, if you don't embrace our traditional family values, by which they mean not the good family values that normal bourgeois people hold, but rather a kind of homophobic conception and an actually patriarchal conception, right? They call these people the American Taliban, people who want men to be the head of the household again, right? In the sense that women only exist to serve their sexual needs and that they're slaves and second-class citizens who can't vote, right? And LGBT people should either be in the closet or executed or whatever, right? There are people who think like that in the United States. And they're all too happy to say, look, if you don't embrace our patriarchal, misogynistic worldview, then you're going to get this woke, matriarchal, kind of heterophobic, cisphobic, neo-Marxist thing. And isn't that scary, right? But of course, the vast majority of people are neither of those extremes. And polls show that a super majority of Americans, at a time when we can hardly get people to agree on, what color the sky is, a super majority of Americans still support same-sex marriage, for example. So we just felt like it was time to stand up for the views that most Americans hold, not just most LGBT people.
I mean, that was certainly the thing that animated my article, was that I'd seen so much of this kind of, I'm going to call it woke right, because I think it is woke, you know, in the sense that the woke believe that they have woken up to some sort of hidden reality that is either very difficult or impossible to access, unless you've had their specific brand of training or educated yourself within it. Whereas these guys, they believe the same thing, right? They're based in the real reality. They've been red pilled. They've actually woken up. Joshua, I mean, with Project Liberal, you have had quite the same thing. I mean, am I right in saying that you come from a largely libertarian background? I mean, libertarian is a flavor of liberalism, if you like.
Yeah.
And you saw things happen within the libertarian movement that weren't to your taste.
Well, yeah, I mean, I wrote an article about this as well in QM, and we talked about this on our last panel, that libertarians historically in the United States have basically been the first to market to champion LGBT rights. They were doing this in the 70s, long before it became part of the national conversation. I like to say now, I really just, I've stopped using the word libertarian to describe myself, because to the point that I think we've discussed back and forth online and in QM articles, that word is becoming, doesn't mean what I think it stands for, right? Those values. I mean, there's been this insurgency in the libertarian movement in the United States to kind of redefine it as this kind of intolerant ideology. And so, yeah, no, but I do think that those of us that believe in libertarian values, I think libertarianism in its core is basically radical liberalism. You know, it's taking that every element of the liberal tradition and kind of pushing it to the extremes. So, yeah, I mean, it is sad to see what's happening in the United States. There's not only a regression broadly in the United States around this issue, but there's also a regression within the libertarian movement, and there's all this infighting and conflict. But yeah, such is the nature of the moment that we live in historically, right now. We're in a kind of very intolerant, illiberal time.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of conspiracy to convert children is the bizarre thing that I want to begin upon. That isn't to say that you can't find these weirdos on TikTok. You can, or you can't find bad actors. You can. You know, gay people are a category of people, and like any category of people that broad, you're going to find some wonderful people in there, and you're going to find some absolute out and out weirdos. That shouldn't be very surprising. But people seem to know that when it comes to Black people, for example, you know, within the United States of America, there are organized criminal gangs of Black people plotting to do some very nasty things. And there may be organized groups of gay people as well. I don't know. But it seems as obvious to everybody that we don't jump from this kind of observation that, yes, we've got this organized group of Black people doing some bad things, to B, therefore, we should view all gay people with suspicion. Why is that? And it seems gay people and Jews seem to be the ones that are targeted.
Yeah, the Jewish conspiracy now. I'm curious what Rio has to say about this, but the Jewish thing now is obviously on the ascendant. I think it goes back to the humans' desire for kind of silver bullet solutions and their tribal nature. Populists really do exploit this in humans, right? It's this idea that really all your problems are due to this one group, and they can benefit politically by casting all the issues and challenges of society onto one group. So I think this is an element of human nature. It's the tribal element of human nature. I think it's an instinct that liberals rightfully push against. I think liberalism as a philosophy that focuses on individuals and the truth, which is that, yes, within any sort of say sexual identity or racial identity, you are going to have a massive amount of diversity of beliefs, of viewpoints. Liberals look at the individual, whereas populists typically try to take those things, characterize that for the group, and then use that to kind of galvanize people to support their authoritarian urges. So I think it's been a problem throughout history. I mean, that was what the Holocaust was caused by this entire instinct, right? And it's led to some of the worst things that humanity's ever seen, this kind of thinking. But in this moment, I think it's incredibly important for us to mount a full-throated defense of individualism and really kind of fight back against those narratives. I know Rio's thought about this a lot too. I'm curious as to his thoughts.
Yeah, that was well said, Joshua. I think you're correct to say that liberalism is the antithesis of that mentality. Of course, a lot of critics of liberalism will say, well, that's a weakness of liberalism in a way, because we're too tolerant of diverse views and things like that. And so we allow anti-liberal people to speak. And when you allow anti-liberal people to speak, they're going to persuade other anti-liberal people to do anti-liberal things, right? And so ironically, you get this type of alt-right or dissident right, or whatever you want to call them. Woke right is a term that's being used now, and I think it's quite apropos. You get this group of people who seem to think that you have to embrace totalitarianism in order to defend classical liberalism. And perhaps some of those idiots are the ones who are taking over your former party, Joshua. I don't know.
Yeah.
But really, it's not. It's a mischaracterization and a misunderstanding of what liberalism is. Liberalism isn't like a willy-nilly, anything goes, tolerate everything philosophy. What liberalism is going back to Adam Smith even, is a recognition of the fact that exchange, whether you're talking like literal capital exchange, or if you're talking cultural exchange, if you're talking political exchange, right? Exchange is not a zero-sum thing. And throughout most of human history, we thought it was. And when you're in a zero-sum mindset, then you're susceptible to things like scapegoating. But when you recognize, as Adam Smith taught us, and as other thinkers before him also touched upon, that it's not zero sum, that it's positive sum, and that when we actually productively collaborate with one another and exchange ideas and goods and services in a free marketplace of ideas, if you will, and a literal marketplace, we're all better off. And so I think what's happened is people have taken the fruits of liberalism for granted, and that's made it possible for people to blame others for what ills still remain in society, when in reality, that's partially because, one, utopia isn't possible. There's always going to be problems in society. And two, problems are often exaggerated by aspects of our culture that are still too anti-liberal, like for example, regulations that strangle the marketplace.
It's also, just to add a little anecdote, it's also funny to me that some of the biggest proponents of this viewpoint that you mentioned, Rio, this kind of idea that we need to tear down liberal institutions and enact an this kind of authoritarian fight back in order to defend them. It's very ironic. They're usually members of like fringe minorities in of themselves. They're susceptible to the same, they'll be susceptible to the same violence if they are able to achieve their goal. So yeah, no, I think you said that very well. That's always a funny little bit of hypocrisy there.
It's worth, I think, fleshing out this idea of trade, because I mean, I think trade, as you allude to, is a fundamental. On the one hand, you could look at it as a principle. If you're going to go down the grand ideas route, some people would say that these are the key philosophical ideas, and the more that we adhere to them, the better off our societies are. I take a kind of dim view of that. I mean, I view these ideas as reflections on traditions that have much more organically evolved out of societies. So I wouldn't say that. I would say that Adam Smith was reflecting the values of Great Britain rather than generating them himself. I think that's a key differentiation. But I mean, you can think either way and be a liberal. On the division, this all really relates back to the division of labor, right? The fact that trade isn't zero sum. If I am really, really, really good at building, if I've spent loads of hours practicing, learning, reading about becoming good at building houses, and Rio, you've become really, really good at hunting, because, again, you've spent loads of hours practicing and becoming really good at that. And Joshua, you've become really good at bookbinding, again, because you've spent lots of time doing that. An hour of my labor building traded with your labor for bookbinding, Joshua, or your labor for building, that's a win-win situation, because we're dividing what we're good at, and that should be obvious. And then you move that on to companies, to countries. Taiwan is going to be a lot better at making semiconductors than Japan is at the moment, or Germany. And so you get a trade of automobiles and semiconductors, and you could do that for any other trade. And that is a win-win for both parties. It's not a zero-sum thing. I'm just curious how this zero-sum thinking is now dominant everywhere. It used to be, through this kind of very Marxist lens that you'd see this on the left, right? And in left-wing academics. But now it's worked its way into the allegedly conservative right, even though it seems to violate one of the most vital traditions that particularly American conservatives, but British ones too, seem to identify with. What's going on?
Yeah, I'm curious what Rio would say, because I don't actually have a prescription. I don't exactly know what's happening. I could speak to what I think. There's been an evolution of thought on this issue, especially on the American right. Like, I think it started off as a conversation maybe about, to some degree, national security. And I think there's some arguments to be made for, like, for example, with semiconductors, if it's mission critical for military operations, I could see you making an argument. But I honestly think a lot of this stuff, to be honest with you, Mike, at least, is because we're in the middle of a populist wave in the United States. And it's due to the nature of the way globalized societies and economies work. So if you have a situation where you have economic dynamism that you see with a globalized economy, there are going to be people that are going to get ahead in some parts of the country, and there are going to be people that don't. And so in the United States, we saw a reduction of, auto manufacturing jobs, as a lot of those went to Asia. That affected the populace there. Those people felt left behind. Those people saw their communities getting carved out. They saw their communities in decline. That's a real problem. Not saying it's not a real problem, but that causes kind of an anger, and it drives economic populism, which then seeks to solve the problem, not by embracing more dynamism and embracing more trade and commerce and seeking to kind of innovate and build more. It's a call to the past. It's this idea that we need to just find a way to build to centrally plan the economy, really, in a way that we can bring my job back in my backyard. And the truth is that this is, and I've spoken to Shikha Dalmia, who's on our board, who's from the Institute of the Study for Modern Authoritarianism. We had a whole conversation about this. This is the hazard of liberal societies, because with economic dynamism, you're going to see some people get ahead and some people not. And it creates these waves of populism where people get left behind and they push back against the liberal order. And I think for liberals, it's important to articulate the bigger picture. It's important for us in these waves to talk about there's a lot more of growth and wins that have happened in the American story. That may not be compelling to that individual voter, but it's very important for the long-term success and growth of our civilization. So again, I don't know. Rio, I'm sure you got thoughts on that as well. But.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that populist demagogues like Donald Trump will tap into a very real sense that people aren't getting ahead anymore, that they're falling behind, or that they're being left behind. But I think we should also be careful to point out, as you know, that those problems do tend to be exaggerated by said demagogues. The vast majority of people voting for Donald Trump are not folks who used to manufacture automobiles in the United States and lost their jobs, right? They're people who have bought into this populist narrative that he's selling, which is based on a microscopic aspect of our overall economy. That said, I do think that liberal elites have some blame as well. I think that, I kind of want to blame anti-liberal elites like Rush Limbaugh for touching it off, because I was thinking about like McCarthy. My wife recently read a book about McCarthy, and we were talking about him. And I was rereading some of his speeches, and something that struck me was that McCarthy would openly advocate liberalism. He would say, we need liberalism, not communism. He used the word liberalism in a very positive way. And we think of him as the arch reactionary anti-communist, right? Well, because of course, as educated individuals, we know that liberalism is pro-capitalism by definition. But people like Rush Limbaugh persuaded a lot of regular folks who were just listening to him while they were doing their jobs that liberalism was the problem. And so what happened is a lot of people like, say, Mitt Romney or John McCain, who are really in the Reagan-Thatcher tradition for the most part, they distanced themselves from the word liberal while continuing to advocate essentially classical liberalism. or what sometimes leftists derogatorily refer to as neoliberalism, which is essentially a resurgence of classical liberalism, thanks to people like Mises and Hayek and Friedman and McCloskey, right? So, if I take my wonk hat off for a second and speak in regular language again, the problem is liberal elites were not advocating liberalism openly anymore and had retreated from it, and were instead speaking about it in other more cynical ways. And I think what we need to do is we need to remind folks that it's not a zero-sum thing. It is a positive-sum thing. And that for every job that we, quote, lost, we actually gained more, right? And the middle class in the West isn't getting rich as fast as it was in the past, but it is nevertheless still very rich in comparison to the places where a lot of those cars are being manufactured, right? So what I think we need to do is we need to have a frank conversation with people who are concerned about things like outsourcing and talk about policies that are liberal ways of addressing those concerns, so that the populist demagogues can't sell their false solutions. Because we all know that tariff wars and things like that are going to cause more harm than good. And conservative economists like Thomas Sowell have called them a catastrophic mistake. And the problem is the average Trump voter isn't really conservative. They might be reactionary, but they're not conservative. If they were, they would know that.
Yeah, and to your point, one of the funny anecdotes I hear from Trump, this is just to add a little bit of additional context to add on to your point. There is this whole narrative that the middle class is shrinking, but to Rio's point, when you actually look at the numbers, the reason why the middle class is shrinking, like 54% of people were middle income in 1967, and today that's 39%. That's because higher income individuals, that share of the population has tripled. And lower income people are we have 10% fewer lower income people now than we did in 1967. That's a win for liberalism. That's
adjusted for inflation.
Adjusted for inflation. That is that's the success of embracing liberal values. And yeah, the middle class is shrinking, but it's great. It's a good thing. It's because people are getting richer.
I want to go back to draw a parallel now between, linking to that between the woke, the traditional, the left wing kind of the people who, I certainly started fighting against. They very much have a victimhood seeking ideology in which they see themselves as oppressed and the victims of homophobia, racism, which isn't to say these things don't exist, they do. But that these things define society. And this new kind of MAGA, I would call them the regressive right. I don't think that they can really be called conservatives either. Traditionally, when we think about what conservative means, and we go back to the tradition of Edmund Burke, who was the 18th century reformer that I based the article I wrote in Queer Majority on, it was all about appreciating that the institutions that we have are flawed and that we have a duty to reform them, but it's not a very good idea to smash the whole thing down and start again and think you can do better, right? Even if you can identify serious flaws, because the consequences of that are likely to be bad for a whole number of reasons. One reason would be that it represents the accumulation of wisdom over the generations. Another reason would be that generally the people who are advocating for smashing these things down don't have really any experience in the affairs of state. So they're not likely to do well. And this was the observation that he made on the French Republic, or what would then become the French Republic, which was also based on ideally on liberal values, really. The French Revolution was really based upon liberal values or based on a version of liberal values. But he thought that was really, really dangerous. Now, you could argue that the Jacobin movement was liberal but gone wrong. But you would never say it was conservative, right? You would never describe somebody like Thomas Paine as a conservative. I wouldn't. But now what we see is in America, these radical regressives calling themselves conservatives and yet advocating for completely tearing everything down, because they are the victims of something, and by and large they aren't.
And it's very similar to what you saw on the left. To that point, somehow conservatism means tearing down our institutions and enacting a strong man to try to make things right. Ria and I think talked about this when we were in DC a couple months ago. Like this is at the center of what I believe is that conservative. Well, first and foremost, before I say this, conservatism today is almost becoming as misdefined as liberalism in the United States has been for the last couple of years. And there are plenty, like actual conservatives can fit in the liberal tradition. I mean, there have been many of them throughout our history. There's nothing about, I mean, there's differences among liberals, but there are conservative liberals, and then there are more progressive liberals that have different views on the way society should operate, the different views of, say, the institution, like the institutions of family, et cetera, et cetera. I think that making that distinction is important. And there's really nothing that triggers the right more, or triggers this modern regressive right more than kind of equating them to the left. But it's absolutely true. But it's a great rhetorical tool because it will definitely get them triggered about things.
It triggers them, but also every now and then there's a self-aware one, or perhaps maybe a slightly better educated one, who will just openly admit to me, oh yeah, you're right, I'm economically left-wing. They'll say I'm only socially conservative, I'm economically left-wing, right? And that's the opposite of a former libertarian like Joshua, right? That's the most authoritarian position you can possibly take, is you want big government interfering in your family life and the economy. Yep. Right. So I think when to Joshua's point where you said that conservatives can be part of the liberal tradition, it made me think about a debate that took place in Toronto, I think it was, between David Frum, who was a speechwriter for George W. Bush, a conservative intellectual, and Steve Bannon. Right. Oh. And this was back when Steve Bannon was still even more influential in the MAGA movement than he is now. And what Frum said to Bannon was, what conservatives have sought to conserve in the West are the fruits of liberalism, by which he meant classical liberalism, right? And Bannon is an enemy of everything that conservatives would have been seeking to conserve. So how did Bannonism supplant conservatism? I think the answer is liberal elites were not standing up for liberal values publicly. They thought they could just manipulate the masses, and eventually that just created an environment where people like Steve Bannon could come along and say, yeah, liberalism is the problem. So I think when we reflect upon the fact that, if you think about it, what do we mean by elites, right? We mean people who are well-connected, educated, they have political power, they have cultural capital, and they have literal capital. They have money, right? That group of people does tend to be, if you look at polling and so forth, that group of people does tend to be quite classically liberal. They tend to be more socially moderate than the average person, and they tend to be more economically conservative, or what we might call classically liberal, than the general population. But how did you get people to vote for that? Well, you did that by cynically manipulating them instead of selling them on it. But they forgot that Ronald Reagan sold people on that vision. He was even rather socially moderate for his time. People forget. So, I mean, he was pro-immigration, for example.
Yeah.
So I think we need to right the ship, and ultimately it falls on the shoulders of people like us to persuade regular people.
On the point of I'm not on mute. Okay. On the point of conservatism, though, I really think that a lot of people, you were talking about your educated friend who admitted, look, I'm economically left-wing, I'm economically socialist, if you like. I start believing in tariffs, all kinds of things like that, in order to protect the working class. I mean, that is pretty much as socialist as you can get. But I am socially conservative. What do they mean by socially conservative? Because I don't think that they really are. Again, there are generally two ways within, the academic field of linguistics. There are two ways at which you arrive at the meaning of a word. One is the classical way, which is meaning by definition. You go into the dictionary and you look at how the word is defined. And the other way is meaning by use. So the classic example would be, Joshua, you said libertarian. Am I a libertarian? Yes and no. Yes, because you hold to a set of values that you identified with libertarianism and have traditionally been libertarianism, and are probably still how libertarianism is defined in a dictionary, which would be the definitional meaning, right? but no, because there's been some kind of concept creep in which libertarianism now means MAGA and tariffs and all these kinds of things that are antithetical to what liberalism in a definitional sense stands for. The same thing is really, really, really true about conservatism. What isn't understood was that what is understood is that conservatism as a political tradition originates with 18th century Edmund Burke. That's pretty much widely acknowledged. What isn't understood was that he was a progressive reformer, right? So he was in favor of things like the slave trade. He was in favor of things like the American Revolution, right? He looked at the American Revolution and he said, the reason why this is happening is because the Americans are being denied their rights that they had inherited from generations before as Englishmen. And he revered Britain and its institutions, as well as America, because they were liberal, because they enabled more freedoms than was common elsewhere in the world at that time. And he believed that we should conserve them because they were advanced. And when you look at LGBT, you look at how we in Britain used to view LGBT. Britain in the 1940s and the 1950s was still relatively more advanced, in terms of our liberal traditions than most places in the world were, far more so. And yet at that time, being gay was illegal. But there's been a complete grassroots, bottom-up shift and we can see this in polling data, shift in how the public have come to see no problem with gay people and have no issue with gay people getting married. That was precisely the kind of change that Burke thought had made Britain advanced, versus the kind of top-down changes that, for example, the French revolutionaries wanted to impose upon their society, a society where it hadn't evolved, organically from the context. And so, as a conservative, you have to, if you are a philosophically coherent conservative, you are conserving liberalism in Britain and America because it is advanced. And it is advanced because these societal changes happen bottom up. And LGBT acceptance must be one of them. And so if you're going to say, well, look, I'm a social conservative and I want to roll things back, that's not conservative, not in a philosophically coherent sense. Maybe in like conservative
I agree.
sense.
I think that there is a philosophically coherent sense in which we are socially conservative, right?
Yes.
Say at Queer Majority, we're trying to stand against an extreme form of identitarianism that is tearing society apart and that actually empowers populist demagogues like Donald Trump, frankly. I mean, wokeness didn't really take off on the left until Trump was the Republican nominee. And then when he won the election, all bets were off. And what I would love to persuade my fellow anti-wokes out there of is that nothing would be better for wokeness than for Donald Trump to win again.
Yes.
It would resurrect it.
Right. So I really truly believe that we should all be both progressive and conservative, to your point about Edmund Burke. I mean, his point was just that you can't force a population to embrace, even if, like, let's say they maybe are superior values. You can't force them to embrace them without first persuading them of that, because doing so would be illiberal. And frankly, it just doesn't work. Yeah. That's why when we try to artificially create a democracy in the Middle East, it doesn't catch, right? It's because the people haven't really embrace the values and the culture behind it yet. It does have to be bottom up. And that's why persuasion is where it starts. The conservative LGBT activist Andrew Sullivan said, it starts with the culture and then the policy will follow. But what the woke have tried to do is they've tried to force the policy down the public's throat. And I think it is socially conservative in a good sense of the word to resist that, which was Burke's point. Did you mean to say he was pro the slave trade, or that's
he was
what
against the slave trade?
Yeah, okay.
I may have
misspoke there. Sorry, no, he was very much against the slave trade and in favor of the American Revolution.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. The reaction on the left, or I should say the reaction on the left to the right, that like kind of tit for tat escalation is part of the reason why this is becoming such a big problem. But no, yeah, Rio, I think you said it well. I don't think I could add much more to it.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I'd like to say about, conservatism and tradition. So, I mean, if we start to think about what are the key liberal traditions. And you can look at that through a kind of like a grand ideas thing, or you could look at that through a traditional lens. But, you talk about freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, private property, like, the freedom to own things is private property, right? These are all liberal. Again, from a descriptive use, these are all liberties. Our societies, Britain and America, fundamentally place emphasis on individual liberties. That's what defines who we are as a people who aren't defined by an ethnicity, for example. We're not like the Japanese, who are defined by their ethnicity as much as anything else. We are defined by these traditions or ideas, whichever way you want to look at them. And they are liberal ideas. I mean, what other adjective would you have to describe it? If you're a conservative, for example, and you're on a university campus and you are speaking out against the segregation of students, as a white student, you do not have the liberty to go and stay in this dorm or whatever. Irrespective of whether or not the dorm selection is legal, if you are standing up against that, you are being liberal, right? If you are a progressive who identifies as being liberal, but you're arguing for that authoritarian imposition, there's nothing liberal about that.
No, absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. Didn't mean to cut you off, Mike.
So we find ourselves with this false dichotomy. You can be staunchly conservative insofar as that you believe that these values that we have, these liberal values such as freedom of speech and so on, that have evolved out of our context, really need to be strongly conserved. And by being deeply conservative, you are being deeply liberal at the same time.
Yeah, and it's not just a matter of semantics, to your point, right?
No.
We don't have to persuade people to use the word liberal the way we're using it. Yeah. That would be lovely. But the broader point is that if you listen to the anti-liberal left and the anti-liberal right, they really are against things like individualism, right? Our friends at the Cato Institute have dubbed, because regressive right and woke right and alt-right weren't enough, they've dubbed this new thing on the right national collectivism, right?
Yeah.
And you will see people saying in that movement, individualism is bad. It encourages people to be, to no longer care about their community. But once again, that's another false zero-sum premise. Adam Smith's whole point was that caring about yourself actually does benefit the community, because you are providing a service that other people need. You're going to make more money, right? So this idea about individualism versus collectivism, it's a false dichotomy, unless you mean collectivist in the sort of neo-Marxist sense, right? Which is of course the kind that they are advocating. And by the way, Marx was a reactionary. Classical liberalism eliminated class, and as far as that term was understood before Marx, he redefined class in reaction to liberalism. And I don't think people on the alt-right realize how Marxist they are in their thinking.
Yeah, and just to dwell for a second on that kind of individualism versus community point, I mean, I think this is really, really poorly understood. Let's say, for example, you want to become the best soccer player in the world, right? That's your goal, and you work really hard and you train at that and you've got all the skills. If you never pass a ball, if you're completely focused on just you and what you're going to do with the football, and you never pass it to anybody else, and you don't think about the team around you and the opposition around you and your community, your community of 11 players on a football field, on a soccer field, sorry for you Americans. But you could use it with American football, that's what you call it. You could use it for that as well. The metaphor works for that too. If you don't think about your team and the people around you, then your individual rights don't mean a fig. And I think this is a massive, massive false dichotomy. I mean, Burke talks about this as well. He talked about individualism being nested in a community of values. So, if you believe in things like individualism, of freedom of assembly, free speech, freedom of religion, freedom of movement, and so on and so forth, those rights have to also be believed by your community, and your community has to be able to do something to articulate them and, if necessary, defend them and stand up for them and defend them, right? Otherwise, the individual right cannot exist. And it's not about it should not exist. Maybe you could say the individual right should come first, but it just can't, right? It has to be advanced for, believed in, subscribed to, and protected by a community. So it's a huge false dichotomy.
Yeah, and I would like to hear what Joshua riff on that, and just to throw out something else for him to riff on, and to further your point, Mike. I think that liberalism is actually not the right word for hyper-individualism, right? A hyper-individualist would be somebody who's an anarchist of sorts, right?
Yeah.
Who believes that you have no government whatsoever. What liberalism does is it recognizes human nature is inherently competitive, but it channels that competition in a productive, positive sum direction through institutions like capitalism and democracy, so that we're not coming to blows with one another over political disagreements and economic disagreements. But yeah, so we're now getting into Joshua's area of expertise. So
say putting me up as an expert. You actually touched on exactly where I was going to go with it. Now there's actually, I think we were talking to Armin about this, or maybe this did come up in the discussion. There is a discussion among liberals around, how, because again, the role of those institutions is to effectively protect against and channel that human nature for positive ends. There is this conversation, even among liberals, around how society should react to people that stand against those values. And my answer to that question is that's the purpose of institutions. That's why institutions must be protected, because they kind of apply those liberal values universally across all individuals. But I digress at this point. That is inherently part of the reason why it's so important to protect America's institutions when they're under threat in a moment like today.
And why it's so dangerous that we have critical pedagogues who are brainwashing students in both public and private schools. It's almost more common in affluent private schools than public schools. So the people who want to shut down the public education system, that's not going to solve the problem either, because the First Amendment protects private schools, but it limits public schools. But in any case, there's this critical pedagogy that's brainwashing students into distrusting liberal institutions like the free press, right? They're buying into the Noam Chomsky argument that somehow the free press is even worse propaganda than actual literal nationalist propaganda, right? And so I think that when you have a generation of people, or 2 or 3 generations, however many it may be, who were brought up to distrust institutions like the free press, to distrust institutions like democracy, then you're not only empowering the would-be communists that they're trying to empower, you're also empowering those fascists who are all too happy to tear down liberal institutions and build their version of totalitarianism.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, very, 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 very frightening. Another thing that I'd like to talk on relating to all of this is this notion that we're getting from both the woke left, if you like, and the woke right, that liberalism is doomed, that it is either going on the whiff of fumes left over by religious identitarianism from previous generations gone by, and that it is still chugging along as it goes right now, but that it's fundamentally doomed, or that the failure has already set in, and that what we need to do
capitalism.
Late stage capitalism. Yeah. I mean, any thoughts on that, chaps?
This goes back to what we were talking about earlier. I kind of think a lot of this belief system is based in false narratives that don't paint a real picture of what's happening in society. I mean, American society is like the most prosperous and in many ways the most free that we've seen in human history. So I don't know. I mean, I just don't take a lot of. I don't believe that. I don't think it's based in actual reality and truth. I think it's based on false narratives. Because not only is the history of liberal societies created, again, the most prosperous and free civilization societies in the history of humanity, but it's, a lot of this doomerism is simply based in lies. It's simply based in lies. And again, I'm not underselling. I'm trying to downplay the fact that real people are suffering, and there are injustices happening. But in the aggregate, I mean, if you could choose any time in history to be alive, you would choose now. Just looking at the numbers, right? So I just take it with a grain of salt. I'm curious as to what Rio might say to that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think another false narrative is the populist myth which is that whatever problems we have are entirely the fault of evil elites, usually who also control the Jewish space lasers, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And regular people have absolutely no blame whatsoever. But as somebody who was brought up very conservative, I remember when we used to talk about things like personal responsibility, right? But the thing about populism is it lets Joe Schmo off the hook. Oh, you're not responsible for any of your choices in life. If you're struggling, it's because the evil space Jewish laser people are making you suffer, right? And all that is a lowbrow version of the neo-Marxist idea that everything is a consequence of structural, oppression.
Yes.
Right? Terms like progressive and conservative, of course, are contextual. Right? If you're a conservative in Saudi Arabia, that's very different from being a conservative here. Being a conservative here means preserving the system that works here, right? And the system that we already have here. If I lived in Saudi Arabia, I'd be a radical, but I'd hold exactly the same values that I already hold. And I think people lose a sense of the contextual nature of conservative when they allow themselves to be persuaded that it actually means its opposite, which is radicalism. If somebody wants to tear down the liberal order, they're not a conservative.
No, they may be a progressive radical or a regressive radical, right?
Regressive, I prefer to say, yeah. Because again, I think we should all try to progress in the sense of improving society. Yep. We just do it gradually through reform because, as the saying goes, any jackass can kick down a barn. Right? It takes real skill and time and investment to build one.
Yeah, and I think that inherently is the difference. I mean, that is, again, the value of liberal philosophy is that understanding that the challenges of society are complex and multifaceted. We cannot pin every issue on society to this group or that group or find a zero-sum solution. In many cases, a liberal solution to a problem, there are many liberal solutions to a problem, right? There's not just one pathway. And that understanding of nuance and the ability for liberals to look at the incentives that drive human behavior is really the only way to govern effectively. It's the reason why we're such a prosperous and powerful society, is because that nuance is incredibly important.
And to reference the great Tom Sowell again, right? There are no solutions. There are only trade-offs, right?
Right.
To solve problem A, it causes problems B and C.
Yep.
And that's why it's an ongoing process. And being a good citizen of a liberal society starts with recognizing that. And the problem with populism is it denies that basic reality. I mean, we live in a democracy, a democratic republic where we elect our representatives, right? And if we're unhappy with the policies they're enacting, ultimately, who's to blame for that, really?
So speaking on problems, Joshua, I've noticed that you tend to deal with this problem in a very similar way that I do. You get somebody online who has one variation on the theme of liberalism has failed, be that a right-wing person or a left-wing person. And what I do often, and what I teach my students to do at university is to hit them with data. Yeah. And so I go where you go, which is Our World in Data, which I got from Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, when he's just smashing that. Love that book. And he's just smashing people with data. And again, it's really not difficult to do. And it's really high quality data, and there's lots of it. You look at pretty much any existing metric: infant mortality, extreme poverty, sanitation, pretty much anything you like. Mm-hmm. And you just see, you might have a blip here and there, but if you look 100 years ago versus today, or even 10 years ago versus today, like, the progress is clear and dramatic. And yet, when I hit these people with these data, it doesn't seem to matter to them. It doesn't seem to break through. Their narrative always seems to survive it. They seem to have invested so much of their identity into this narrative that it doesn't matter how objective the proof is that, we've got, on the one hand, liberalism, and we've seen how liberalism has expanded. And then we've got pretty much every single measure of human progress. And we've seen massive progress in absolutely every single one of them. Correlation is not causation. I get it. But when you've got that much correlation, there's got to be something there, chaps. How is it that we can't
establish causation in the book as well?
Of course, yeah. Well, I wasn't talking so much about the book. I was talking more about Joshua and I just hitting them with data, with screenshots from our world and data.
I mean, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I really do think. I mean, I think there's different motivations for different people, and I think this is the real. Maybe we touched on this earlier. This is a real challenge for liberal thought because, like, for example, we could sit there, we could look at all the objective figures, and we could say, look, things are moving in the right direction. These are objectively true. Then people have an anecdote from their personal life, or they, they talk about one thing, like, this injustice happened here. That's got to be a failure of the system. So combating that is different for every person, because I think every person has a different motivation and a different reason to maybe believe the things that they believe. And there's not a silver bullet solution. It's a liberal response, but it is a real challenge. I mean, it is a real challenge. I mean, that is the inherent weakness of liberalism, right? I mean, it's like, we are the dominant ideology that built this country. So we're going to be the center. They're going to be the targets of really every criticism. And I think there's different ways to approach it for different groups, but it is a challenge, 100%. And we're getting more polarized, so it's getting worse. It's getting harder.
Yeah, and to your point, Joshua, liberal elites, once again, it really is on us to take some responsibility for that. Journalism, the saying goes, if it bleeds, it leads, right? And so people, and Pinker talks about this in his book, right? People will report on the fact that an airplane crashed, but you don't read like, oh, by the way, airplane crashes have gone down every year, blah, 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 right? Or they'll report on, this town where the manufacturing plant shut down and now everybody's worse off, but they don't report on the fact that both nationally and globally, everybody's getting richer, right? And so part of the reason that people pay more attention to the anecdotes than the data is because people like us who are in charge of institutions and are capable of writing and publishing books and articles and so forth aren't doing our job.
I'm trying
to. In many ways, forgotten, as you mentioned earlier, how to do our job.
So this is precisely the point that I'd like to close on, and I'd like to really hear your reflections on. What I've noticed, to build on, we are failing, right? So we have all of this success, all of this data, all of these concise graphs that we can just throw up and show that how successful human life has been. Again, books like Enlightenment Now, against every single metric, and yet we're still not persuading people. This to me shows the limitations of reason. It shows that reason isn't enough to persuade people. If reason was enough, the ability of the human mind to correlate data, to form it together, to form persuasive arguments, if that was enough, we would be out and out winning. There is a trick that we are missing that the woke left and the woke right seem to be doing way, way, way better than we are. And that is, I think, and this is where I think actually Project Liberal and Queer Majority are beginning to do something right that other people aren't doing well. And that is this idea of demos, or themos, if I'm going to say it correctly in the ancient Greek pronunciation. Demos is the root word of democracy, the rule of the people. We aren't building, I think you guys are starting to, but we as liberals haven't started or haven't done enough yet to start to think of ourselves not as a people necessarily bound by a set of abstract ideas, but a fundamental sense of values and a sense of who we are, as opposed to what we think. The woke right have who we are, just like the Nazis had who we are. They had their whole symbols, their branding. They were really good at that. Similarly, the communists in the Soviet Union with their propaganda, the Soviet Union was a bankrupt system and it failed inevitably. But they were better at propaganda than the Americans were. The Americans weren't bad back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But they had their brilliant branding. In the United States, you have wonderful branding with the Star Spangled Banner and the flag, UK too. But we aren't really using this as much as we should. And this is why I think we should return to a kind of a more conservative emphasis on traditions. You can have, look, we think this for rational reasons. That's fine. Continue to use those arguments. I'm okay with that. But a sense of liberalism as a set of traditions that defines us as a people. I think that is really, really needed, and strong branding and strong messaging going forward.
100% agreed with you on that. And that, actually, to your point, we talked about this earlier. The liberal identity is inherently the American identity. At least that's the way I look at it here in the United States. Like we are the ones that get to take and claim the Statue of Liberty and the American flag. We're the ones that get to claim those symbols as our own. But we talked about this on the last panel. Whether we like it or not, humans are very tribal, right? They're looking for a tribe. The problem that liberals have is that we have this diverse group of people with very different beliefs, cultural beliefs, political beliefs. As we've talked about, there's 12 different liberal solutions to an issue. What we're trying to do with our project is articulate, and we're putting out like a manifesto and a list of values on this in the coming weeks. Articulate clearly what those broader values are that tie liberals together. For me, I think, and I think many of you guys would agree with this, I think that's individual liberty. I think it's capitalism. I think it's international cooperation. I think it's tolerance, right? I think there's one more that we had written down that I'm blanking on now. Long story short, it's many of those values. And what we need to do in this moment is we need to remind people about those values, give them a collective identity and a tribe. Oh, and democracy. That was the one I forgot. I don't know how I could forget democracy. It's pretty foundational. Give those people a tribe, bring those people together, and fight back against the populist extremes, which, by the way, in this moment, are in the midst of a convergence against us. So we have a fight ahead of us, whether we like it or not, and it's on us to come together, do what Rio said, articulate the wins, articulate why they matter, and put aside our differences on the fringes and say, look, these are the real core issues that we agree on. Let's come together and defend those together in this moment.
Yeah, and to be clear, the reason I keep saying it's on people like us is because what Mike said is completely true. You can't win with reason alone. That's an attempt to, I mean, first of all, it is reasonable. It's true what I'm saying, but it's also an attempt to reach populists emotionally where they are and say, hey, you know what? You're right. Elites have some responsibility too. My point is we all share the blame, right? And what our organizations or what we have in common is we're all trying to correct the ship and ensure that whether you're talking about academia or public policy or just normal public discourse, not just in magazines, but on Twitter, right? Whatever you're talking about, we need to right the ship and get back to that. The tribalism thing, I want to riff on that a little bit. I think it kind of comes down to the difference between, and in this way, I'm kind of using it in the colloquial parlance, but the difference between what we normally think of as cultural relativism, which is the sense that, hey, you know, different people wear different kinds of clothes and make different kinds of food, et cetera, right? Or even to speak different languages. And what we might call moral relativism, which that's the area where we need to push back. I think it's great that there's a taco truck on every corner. Right. I think that the woke left is insane to attack people for cultural appropriation. I think we should all borrow from each other, and that's a wonderful, beautiful thing. And that is the liberal position, right? But we're not moral relativists. We believe that the liberal way of doing things is superior, and we need to reassert that. And I believe that is the basis of our tribe. Also, by the way, shared culture. We have a shared culture in history. Not just as Americans, but, you know, Mike's British. We share a culture with Britain. Mike, you're more qualified than most people to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing.
Yeah, my point's made. I'll let you close out.
The thing that I always point out to Americans like Joshua, who would hold up the United States Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and say that these are. You Americans tend to worship those documents, and I think they're brilliant documents. They are the distillation of thousands of years, going back throughout the whole of England, but also into the Greek city-states and the Roman Republic and then Empire, of culture, philosophy, and it's distilled. But the only way that it works, again, if you take those principles and you give them to a society in Gaza, they'll go and elect Hamas, right? The only reason that it worked for the Americans in America was because, as they said at the time, they were Englishmen and they were being denied their rights. And these values were an articulation of English values, would be the only point that I make. But I tend to annoy Americans when I say that. But it's not a critique. It's not a critique of the Constitution or of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, if anything, I would have held, like Burke, I would have argued that the British Parliament had its legal right to refuse the Americans independence, but it was more in violation of British cultural values than the American revolutionaries were. And I would also argue that in many ways that there was a period of isolation between Britain and America, but at least since the end of World War I, more so after World War II, and then the explosion of Hollywood media and on steroids since the internet, that the Anglosphere, particularly the Britons and the Americans and the Australians, are on a convergence course culturally, that we're kind of growing back together, having once been apart. And that's perhaps one last thing I'd like to talk about, unless you guys have anything else to raise, would be, when we're talking about how do we reclaim that we need this tribalism, right? The reason alone that, Steven Pinker alone making all of these reasoned arguments isn't enough. That's an arrow on our quiver, and we can continue to improve upon it, but it's not enough. That we need some kind of appeal to the demos, appeal to the tribe. I think personally we need to reclaim patriotism. I think that we've given patriotism to Donald Trump and MAGA and their equivalents in the UK and the US, who are arguing for things that are absolutely antithetical to the kind of values that evolved throughout ancient Greece and the Roman Republic and Empire, through Great Britain, through America in its early stages, standing up to the tyranny of English rule. They're not the patriots. They don't embrace those values. Those values are the values that we are championing right now. George Washington famously said that he wanted to see America amongst the most liberal of nations, and the more liberal it got, the better America would be. We are the inheritors of that patriotic tradition, be we patriotic Brits or Americans, or people just patriotic of the broad culture that is evolving in the Anglosphere. I think that's how we reclaim tribalism. Personally.
I think, that has to be at the center of it 100%. I mean, it's worth noting this is nothing new, like the bastardization and the faux patriotism. I mean, the last America First rally that was held in the 30s had remember this big image of George Washington at a literal Nazi rally in New York City. So, I mean, these kind of co-opting of these symbols among these movements is not abnormal. The ironic, it is faux patriotism though, because I mean, like Donald Trump, for example, wants to put people in jail for burning the flag, desecrating the flag. Meanwhile, his followers are out there with big big flags with his face on it. I mean, I could think of a more desecration of the flag than slapping this 80-year-old convicted felon on the front of it. So I guess I could not agree more. And that's a through line in the way that we like to talk about things, is exactly what you said. We're the inheritors of the American tradition. We're the real patriots. And call out faux patriotism for what it is. I mean, it's a bastardization of these symbols. Because again, when you're looking at a liberal versus, say, a MAGA person, the MAGA people are going to be flying the the Trump flag in front of their house. The liberals are going to be flying the American flag. But no, I think it works. And again, there's nothing I think that really drives that home, though, like I think the Statue of Liberty, because when you really look at the value, I mean, when you look at what's written at the base of the Statue of Liberty, it's antithetical to these modern day populist movements in the United States on both the right and the left. So, yeah, we get to claim it. And I'm not going to stand down from that one.
All right. Give me your cold, tired, huddled masses. Is that right? Something like that.
Yeah.
Something like that.
You're cold, tired, huddled masses yearning to breathe free. There's a lot more wretched refugees. Yeah, I don't have it all committed to memory, but maybe next time I can recite it for you, Mike.
Such a disappointment, Joshua.
Yeah, and to your point, Joshua, when we say we are the real patriots, we're not making a partisan point, right? We're not saying Democrats are the real patriots. And I'm not even sure. I mean, I'm going to be voting for Kamala Harris, but that's only because the alternative is Donald Trump instead of Nikki Haley. You know what I mean? So I would like to see both parties recenter on traditional American values. And I'm happy to see the Democrats are doing it right now. But if the Republicans start doing it, I would like nothing more than to reward them for that by voting for them.
Agreed 1,000,000%.
All right, so let's just summarize. We have long seen illiberalism on the left, the woke left. We are seeing a mirror movement on the woke right that like the woke left, is red-pilled and based and believes it is aware of some kind of hidden reality that everybody else doesn't get. Everybody else is sheeple. As a consequence of that, we are seeing a rise of intolerance, particularly towards Jewish and gay people who are being accused of being behind this crazy conspiracy theory or that one, as opposed to Jewish and gay people just being people, meaning that there are bad and brilliant ones, just like everybody else. We talked about how gay rights had evolved naturally in Britain and America through genuine changes in the public consciousness, and how that is a good indication of why we are advanced as a people. We talked about different traditions of liberalism. One will be liberalism as a set of grand ideas. The more that we apply to those ideas, the better our societies are. The other viewed it more as a kind of messy hodgepodge of traditions that have worked, and that we should conserve our institutions because, you know, they might be flawed, but they've still delivered this wonderful status quo that Joshua, Rio, and I like to slap people around with when we use graphs from Our World in Data, having learned that trick from Steven Pinker, probably. We talked about liberalism and conservatism, about how, you know, if you believe in things like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, freedom of the press, that these are traditions that have uniquely evolved in places like Britain and America, that set ourselves apart from other places in the world that don't have them, and kind of define who we are. So if you're a conservative and you're really bang on and fighting for freedom of speech and of assembly and of the press and so on and so forth, private property being another one, again, the freedom to own, you're being a pretty passionate liberal, even if you don't think of yourself as one. Good. And then finally, we ended up on patriotism. That, again, these are the values that define us as British people, as Americans, and perhaps people in the Anglosphere more broadly, or even beyond that in the liberal world. So thank you very much for listening, and good night.
Thanks. Appreciate it,
Or
Mike.
good morning. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Rio.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you. Okay.